We're filming in Aspen, Colorado today, and I'm pleased to have Randy Sandke, trumpeter and arranger and composer, for our guest for the Hamilton College Jazz Archive.
No, thanks.
Welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. I have to admit that I prejudged your playing, your sound, because as I looked at some of the press and I'd see your name connected with Dick Hyman revival things and all that, I said, I think I know what to expect from this gentleman. And then I heard this.
Right. But that's still pretty mainstream stuff. That's nothing too far out.
But it's an interesting, it's a great introduction for this tune. How did you conceive of it?
Well, that's actually the verse of the tune.
That's the verse.
That is the written verse.
Yeah.
We're, I think we might have added a few changes or something, but that's really part of the tune.
Yeah. It sounds hipper than I thought it was going to be.
Right.
Nice.
Right.
And
I think the one that really threw people for a loop was the record after this, which had Ray Anderson and Michael Brecker, and the first tune on it is Lullaby of Broadway. And I know that I think it was Jazzbell Collins was, he got the record, Randy Sandke, well, this will be nice kind of like, easy listening jazz, and put it on, and it's like supposed to be this cacophonous picture of, New York at rush hour kind of thing. And so he was a little bit thrown for a loop. So
Right.
that happens sometimes with people encountering my music.
would you bring in Michael Brecker and that crew and do that at the Aspen Jazz Festival?
Well, I mean, it's not, I don't really hire the people here. It's
Right.
But, that is one of the, I don't know, that's an aspect of jazz today, and it's kind of, sometimes it's problematical for me because people tend to get labeled and pigeonholed, and I understand that. I think it's easier. It's probably a better career move to be identified with one thing. You're more saleable. People know what to expect. But me personally, I have a hard time with that just because of, I think, the various kind of accidents that sort of form my personal career, which, I mean, I can go into now if you want.
We'll get, or we'll get to that.
Whatever, yeah.
But continuing that thought,
Right.
that do you ever feel that you're not included in things that you could be because you're considered more of a mainstream?
Definitely, yeah, right.
So it's a double-edged sword to have a label, I suppose, because that you will be invited to these jazz parties, but you might not be included in.
Right. No, I think that definitely happens, yeah.
Yeah, and the record companies seem to focus on a few of the young lions business and put their strength behind them.
Right, which is fine. I mean, I don't begrudge them. I mean, I think most of the ones that get the attention are, extremely talented and they're terrific players. The only thing that bothers me a little bit is that it seems like some styles count today and others don't. And if you look at it from a creative viewpoint, it's a little mysterious because to me it seems like if a young guy plays like Freddie Hubbard or Woody Shaw, that's taken seriously, whereas if you listen to Buck Clayton and Louis Armstrong, that's not. To me, they're both equally repertory, at this point. And one of the things that troubles me, I mean, it used to be a basic tenet of jazz that to be a major player, you really had to say something different that was really, almost more than just having a personal style. The great players would influence all musicians on all instruments because they were really taking it in a new direction. And now it seems like, the marketing is kind of taken over, and so they want to sell something. In order to sell something, you have to sell something that people are kind of already familiar with. So much to do is made about guys who are very talented, but are kind of, treading on ground that's been pretty well cultivated before, and it's done quite well and everything, and that's fine. But I understand all the dynamics of it from the record companies, the magazines, etc. I guess if I have a criticism, maybe it's to the critics who should be saying, well, this is fine, but trying to encourage some of the more creative things going on.
Mm-hmm.
And that I find a little lacking these days.
Yeah. Jazz has moved awful fast in its history,
Yeah,
it seems like, and
sure.
I'm constantly wondering where can it go from here? I mean, it's been through the electronic end of it,
Right.
and
Well, I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot in musical terms that could be developed that hasn't been, in terms of even harmony, in terms of extended forms, compositionally. I mean, there's a whole lot of things that could be done. And it is being done, and it will be done, and all that. But I think that it's not, at this particular moment, that's not what's really being focused on. It's more kind of, the attitude seems to be, we're going to take a breather from all this because all the crazy, because the innovation was getting too crazy and too removed from the audience. So now it's time to just kind of retrench and establish an audience, sort of institutionalize jazz, concentrate on its classic history and all that. And that's fine, that's great. But, you have to be careful that it doesn't go the way of classical music and just become a museum piece.
yeah,
It's got to be living, it's got to be new, it's got to be daring, it's got to be innovative too.
to help to grab a young audience.
Well,
I would
just
hope.
yeah, just to and that's happening. I mean, there are players like Dave Douglas, a very fine trumpet player who is really just beginning to get the attention he deserves, and he's kind of associated with that knitting factory crowd, which has been kind of on the fringe, but. Some of that stuff is getting very sophisticated. Some of the musicians who do it are terrific, and they're really doing some interesting things. I mean, that's just to name one example. I mean, there are other people around too.
Well, you started out with some influence from your older brother.
Right,
Was it trumpet?
Jordan, that's right, yeah.
Yeah. And kind of, you're just about my age, and I remember listening to a lot of pop music, and then being greatly affected by groups like Blood, Sweat, and Tears and stuff. Was that something that, did you share that?
Well, yeah, I mean, not them specifically. I mean, basically how I got into listening to jazz was, I guess, through my older brother. I mean, our parents had some 78s that belonged to, I guess, their parents, and it was a very mixed bag, but in it were some kind of interesting things. I mean, nothing great, but, I mean, like there was something by the Georgians, like this little combo from the 20s, and Bob Crosby's Bobcats with Bob Haggart, which was really nice, great arrangement that he did. Some jazz things, and that just caught our ear. And my brother started playing drums, and so we had a drum set in the house, and so I started playing, and I always was trying to keep up with my older brother. Then he brought a trumpet home, and so I started playing the trumpet. And he started buying these jazz records, LPs at the time, and kind of gravitated towards the Louis Armstrong story, Bix Beiderbecke story in Columbia, which George Avakian did. So when I was, 10, 11, 12, I was really absorbed in that. And pretty soon thereafter, we were listening to Clifford Brown and Dizzy Gillespie, and one thing, this was in the, like the late 50s, early 60s, I guess. One advantage that we had was that a lot of these people were still around then,
Yeah.
so I could hear them. I only heard Louis once, but, it was just a completely, mind-altering experience, And, Duke Ellington, I was fortunate to hear, when he still had his band with Johnny Hodges and Harry Carney. We were in Chicago, and there's this beautiful theater on the campus there at the University of Chicago. It's called Mandel Hall. Small theater with beautiful acoustics. And we just came in early, and we were sitting in the front row, and, they were just all there, Cootie Williams, all these people. And, it was just awe-inspiring.
Yeah.
So those experiences really changed my life. Coltrane, I heard, a lot of people I only unfortunately heard once, but at least I heard them once. I would hear Miles with his various quintets and all that. So
Your parents must have been fairly supportive
Yeah, they were. I mean, they were university people. They were pretty broad-minded. They didn't seem to have a problem with me wanting to be a musician, which was, very fortunate,
Yeah.
because that can be a real conflict for some people. If
Right.
their parents say, this is.
Can't you just keep it as a sideline?
Yeah,
maybe?
right. Yeah.
Well, what was your first actual ensemble experience where you started to make a few dollars?
Well, I was working in high school with some bands, mostly rock bands. There was one band that I played in which was just 2 electric guitars and bass guitar and drums and trumpet. So that, and I remember because, they used to play everything in the key of E and A. So I used to actually borrow this cornet that I could, play. I think if I pushed the slides all the way in, I could kind of play in rather than having to play an F sharp and B, I could play an F and B flat or something like that. I don't know, but it worked out some crazy way. And I had to play. It was good experience just to play. I was always playing all kinds of different music from the start. The downside of it was that I started developing this problem, which really caught up with me later, which was that playing with these amplified instruments. Back then, the amplification thing was pretty new. And, people didn't, the sound systems people used weren't, and the miking wasn't that sophisticated. And usually, if you were a horn playing with amplified instruments, you were kind of at a disadvantage.
I guess.
That coupled with the fact that, I was pretty much self-taught. I had some lessons, but as far as just basic technique, I had a few bad habits that really caught up with me with a vengeance. And make a long story short, I ended up developing this problem in my throat, which was kind of like a hernia, just a tear in the muscle in my throat, which got worse and worse and worse, kind of through my first couple of years of college, to the point that I just decided,
no more trumpet.
Screw this, yeah. So I ended up quitting for 10 years.
No kidding.
Yeah, didn't touch the horn.
Yeah. Did it heal itself?
Well, I had, when I was 19, I had an operation on it, which at the time, because I really didn't know what was causing the problem, and I was kind of perpetuating the same bad habits, that after it healed and everything, and I started playing, it started doing the same thing. So I didn't think it was a success, but I think it had pretty much, it had taken care of the problem. So 10 years later, when I started playing again, which was all almost totally by accident, I immediately decided, well, if I'm going to do this, I want to start with a, teacher, an excellent classical player. Started studying with this man Vince Penzarella, who plays in the Philharmonic, and he's taught John Faddis and Wynton Marsalis, and he's, I just can't say enough about the guy. He's just great. And he had been in a car accident and really messed up his face, and so he had to start. He'd been a professional, and he had to start again. And so he'd been through a similar thing, and he'd really had to analyze, how you do it. So, that was just perfect to have hooked up with him at the time I did, and just start over with a clean slate. And he really made me understand just the basic dynamics of playing the trumpet, which are fairly simple, but if, whether you get them intuitively or learn them, it's like the laws of physics and biology. You have to work in harmony with them. If you don't, it's going to be trouble. So you learn those things, or you absorb that, and then you can go on.
You were able to stay in music in those 10 years, though.
Well, sort of. I had a pretty checkered history in there. I was at Indiana University, and then I went back to Chicago and ended up working in the library, the biomedical library sciences building there for a while. Saved enough money to buy a car, get out of town, ended up in Bennington, Vermont, because I had some friends from high school that were there. And ended up accompanying for dance classes. But, also I was working at this fast food restaurant, and but I ended up being there for about 3 years, and and then ended up leaving. It kind of, I mean, it's not worth going to this huge story. If we had 2 hours to talk about it, you kind of had a little problem with Bill Dixon. I don't know if you know that name. He's a trumpet player and a teacher, a kind of avant-garde leaning guy, but we just had some problems, and so I decided it was time to move on. And came to New York and started playing guitar, continued playing piano, accompanying for dance classes, was running an elevator, doing all kinds of odd jobs. By the end of the 70s, I was playing, 5 nights a week in this funky little club on the Upper West Side, which is long gone, called Clifford's Lounge.
Playing guitar or piano?
Playing guitar.
Yeah.
And I was starting, so I was starting to make a meager existence playing music. But the one thing that I realized was that I just, I kept on thinking, well, if I get the chops together, I'll start enjoying it as much as trumpet. Well, I started developing technique, and I got so that I could, play it, okay. But I never liked it as much, and it was only at the time when I started to get, kind of a little bit proficient that I realized it. There were some things that always bothered me about the guitar after playing the trumpet, one of which is that the sound is coming out of another place. It's coming out of this amp over here. I could never get used to that. You're playing here. Trumpet is just like an extension of your head. It's just like part of your, it feels like part of your body. Guitar always felt with the electronics and everything, and to control your sound by turning dials and all that. I just could never, and also not to mention hauling the amp around. Right. I hated that. So, so about that time, an old friend of mine from Indiana University just wanted to come to New York, and we had an extra room in the apartment that we had. I was sharing with some other musicians, and so he came in, and he knew me from when I was a trumpet player, and he said to me, if you don't want to play, that's one thing, but if you think it's because of some physical thing, I really think that there's a way to get around it, and you should at least try. His name is Michael Gribrock, and he's still a really good friend of mine. And he talked me into just, here was a trumpet player, who had had a lot of problems and stayed in Indiana, stuck it out, studying, and kind of managed to get over some of these things. And so, the horn was there, and I started to play it. And I realized immediately that whether I could play it well or just do it as a hobby or whatever, immediately I just enjoyed it much more. And it was obvious that's, what it's all about. So I thought, all right, what the hell, I'll just see what happens. And then shortly after, I started studying with Vince Penzarella. 6 months later, my brother moved to town, and there was a job he couldn't make, and so he said, could you sub for me? And so I ended up, 6 months later, I was working, in New York, and with no expectation of it being a career or anything, but it just kind of evolved.
That first time after picking up the trumpet after 10 years, did your chops remember what it felt like?
Well, yeah, kind of. Although I was conscious that, I wanted to play differently than I had before, because if I was going to do this, I didn't want to have the same problems.
Yeah.
My fingers, when Mike was teaching me at the beginning, he said, I'm used to teaching beginners who don't know the fingerings, and here, it's like,
Right.
So, I tried to play, I wasn't trying to play high, loud, anything, but I would just, play tunes, middle register things, and I don't know, I just, it really, from the start, felt that connection again.
Was the guitar, your experience with the guitar and the piano, does that help your trumpet improvising?
Well, I guess it didn't hurt. Although before I had a pretty good grounding in harmony, and I think what it's helped is my writing a bit. For instance, in guitar, one of the things you concentrate on is how to voice chords with 2 notes, with 3 notes, with more notes than that. For instance, if you're a horn player, the difference between a C7 and a C9 is negligible, because what you play on top of it is virtually the same. But when you play a rhythm instrument, they're quite different sounds. Also, I think where it helped was just being part of a rhythm section too, because that's really a different head. And that's why a lot of guys play drums, play bass, play piano or something like that. Because as a horn player, I mean, you can't just sort of float on top of everything else. When you're a rhythm section player, it's a different perception. Horn player tends to hear the whole thing as a unity, and when you're a rhythm section player, you're always trying to, you're aware of your, meshing your individual sound, what you're doing with the others to try to get this common groove going. In a way, it's a little more work as a rhythm player, I think.
You have to find your spot in the
like you're always working to make it gel, whereas it's kind of, as a horn player working with the rhythm section, you kind of already feeling the totality of it,
So after the trumpet became part of you again, you entered into the competitive scene in New York City.
Right.
When I look at the local 802 book, and I see, page after page of trumpets, page after page of saxophones.
Right.
I
Well,
wonder,
they're mostly part-time guys.
Yeah.
And, well, see, the thing was that I was able to find a niche, and I mean, this is kind of interesting because this is sort of where, this thing developed in my career, which has been, kind of a blessing and a curse, because now my orientation, when I left college, I went to college with Michael Brecker, and I mean, the stuff he was listening to then, I mean, his listening habits were a little more advanced than mine. I would say when we were in school, when we were both like 18 or 19, I'd say mine were a little broader than his, but he was like really honing in on, Coltrane, the latest stuff, I mean, stuff that Wayne Shorter, Miles was doing, just when these records came out, he had them. He was like listening to them day and night. And so, that was part of it. When I was in college, I mean, Freddie Hubbard was my idol. I love Freddie Hubbard, and I was, I like to play in that sort of way. Well, when I'm in New York, and it's, now it's like, early 80s, I just decided that I wanted to play and I wanted to take any jobs I could and get as close to jazz work as possible. Well, at that time, I just found this niche working in traditional jazz, which I didn't know existed. I didn't know that I was going to become a part of it. But the thing is, because I had started out listening to that music, and it was so much a part of my consciousness, Louis, Bix, those tunes. I remember sitting down and making a tune list. Because Ed Polser was working at Eddie Condon's. This was the last Eddie Condon's on 54th Street. And he was always looking for subs, and there just weren't that many guys, especially younger guys, who knew this stuff. And so I just wrote down a list of tunes, of the old tunes, and I was just, it kind of astounded me how many of them I just knew already, So that was an advantage right there. So then I'm working at Condon's, and then I'm kind of in this freelance pool, and working with Vince Giordano's Nighthawks, and then Bob Wilbur, and then Benny Goodman, and all that. And at that time, I mean, maybe because there was a sort of stigma, there always has been, except maybe until very recently, about playing. I mean, there still is to an extent, playing older styles. There were just very few people doing it. Also, the guys of that generation who were doing it, they were getting in their 60s, 70s, 80s. If they weren't dead, they were like out of commission. And I would get work that way. For instance, I can remember a tour that Billy Butterfield was supposed to do, and he had some health problems, and so I had to step in and do it, things like that. And that sort of got me into the jazz party circuit, and here I am now. And now, like I should make it clear, I've always had this emotional connection to this music, to that style.
Yeah.
Or those styles. I mean, it's a pretty broad spectrum in itself. But there's always been this other part of me too that has wanted to do really creative things and not imitate Freddie Hubbard or Woody Shaw, but like do stuff that nobody else is doing.
Which shows up on your recent records
to an extent, although
yeah.
I think the more adventuresome stuff that I've done has not been recorded. Some of it I'm starting to. You know, again, I mean, well, to back up, you know, it's 1985 when I was working with Benny Goodman, and almost all my work was in, you know, in that swing, Dixieland kind of stuff. I financed my own first record, you know, just saved up, I think it was $5,000, and, you know, and hired, you know, got Mike Brecker and Jim McNeely and John Goldsby, Kenny Washington, and did all originals in a modern context. That was my first record, and it got, you know, I still, in some ways, I still like that the best. I mean, I think, you know, I'm a better trumpet player now, but I feel good about that record, and there's a lot of me in it. And it got pretty good critical response for, you know, for wherever it was, whenever it was reviewed. But it led to absolutely nothing in the way of work.
Yeah.
You know, no jobs, no nothing. You know, couldn't get into clubs, couldn't, you know, nobody was hiring me as a sideman, nothing. So, you know, I continue working, getting more and more established in this vein, and also traveling to Europe, getting more established over there, you know, everywhere as this mainstream trumpet player. You know, then by, you know, the early 90s, and, you know, so I'm working with, like, the younger guys I'm working with are some of the guys who were here, you know, Ken Poplawski, Howard Alden, Scott Hamilton, guys who are on Concord. And this was when, of course, Carl Jefferson was still alive. He was the founder. And largely through Ken, I ended up getting on Concord, and I still record for them. Now, Carl Jefferson, his niche that he found for that record company was to record all this mainstream music, which the other labels had totally neglected in this country. And especially the younger guys like Scott Hamilton, Warren Vichet, people like that, you know, that were out there, you know, making a living, getting, you know, like the people who listen to them, you know, like they really have their, you know, their, I don't know, fan base, whatever you want to call their constituency. And yet a lot of times they're really not, you know, they're kind of ignored in the larger, you know, the jazz press, something. But, and by the record companies. So, you know, Carl found that, well, there's this audience, there's this gulf between what this group of the audience wants to hear and what's being presented. And so he was able to do that and became quite successful. So, as I say, largely through Ken, I was introduced to Carl, and I ended up getting signed by Concord. But it was still kind of in the guise of a mainstream artist. And so the records, I've just done my fifth. They've kind of, you know, started out, you know, like my first record with them, I just decided, well, I'm going to make a nice, happy little mainstream jazz record. I mean, one of the problems was that when I would go to the jobs, like such as this, or, you know, the jazz parties, I couldn't really take that record that I'd done because it alienated people. I mean, it still has that effect. I mean, I won't mention any names, but there's still a guy who will not hire me because his first experience of listening to me was hearing that record, and he can't reconcile the fact, well, you know, that, you know, I mean, this guy, you know, like I just want to play mainstream or you know, whatever, and I'm afraid he's going to start playing play a Woody Shaw lick or something and ruin the whole. So, you know, I still have that problem. I needed something to sell and to promote for this, you know, where the direction my career was going. So I made this record and, you know, just tried to make it as well as I could at the time. And then with each successive one, I've tried to be, you know, a little bit more adventurous. To the third one, which Carl Jefferson was there, you know, and I had him okay, you know, Ray Anderson, Mike Brecker, Smitty Smith, and he said fine. And just before we did it, he came to New York, and we were having dinner the night before we did it, and he was saying to me, you know, you can't be all things to all people. You have to decide what you want to do, you know, which was a little deflating to hear just before I'm about to do this record, which is really going to be going in another direction. I'm thinking, you know, well, he's going to hear this stuff and he's going to hate it. So we get into the studio, and the first tune I think we did was that Lullaby of Broadway. And surprisingly enough, he liked it once he, and he heard Ray Anderson, and he said, wow, this guy is great, and, which was really nice that, I felt like he sort of trusted me, and if he heard it and he heard that there was some integrity to it, that he would go along with it. So that was encouraging. Then, a short year after that, he died. And so now, the company is kind of going through a little bit of financial insanity, but supposedly everything is going to continue. The last record that I did for them was totally different because I've been, I've kind of found a little more freedom in the writing area, that I'm not so pigeonholed and I can do more daring things in writing. So the last record that I did was with a symphony orchestra. It's not out yet, it'll be out in a couple months. And I did things on that from, like contemporary classical music to modern. And even what I got to put on this record is, after my first record, about a year or two later, I did a second record, which was, kind of going further into more personal areas, different kinds of stuff. And I could not get any record company interested in it. They just, no interest at all. So, and I invested a lot of money in the project. Finally, 10 years later, some of that stuff is going to be released with the symphony stuff. And, it's, I have to admit, that's the stuff that's closest to my heart because it's the stuff that it's more just me,
Is that where you did the arrangements on the Bach?
Well, there's one piece that's kind of from that, but, well, the first symphony concert that Ken Poplawski and I did, I wrote three things, an arrangement of Ellington Strayhorn tunes, which will be on this record, and then this version of the Goldberg variations, where the orchestra would play a variation, and then the jazz quintet would do a variation on the same material. And also this other piece, which is on the record, which is just kind of contemporary classical music. And I like to write, I've kind of developed a way of writing and improvising, which I really want to go into more. I've done some, but it hasn't been recorded too much, which involves, it's like a way of relating harmonically, like relating melodically to a harmony, but not a tonal harmony. So you're playing on changes, but it's not based on scales, and it's not based on chords you can write with conventional chord symbols. And there's just a lot there that hasn't been tapped, and
Reminds me of Ornette Coleman's
the harmonic.
And
but
I'm not sure I understand it.
Well, see, that's the thing. I mean, that's something that again bothers me, and to me shows the deficiency of jazz criticism, and the fact that, like some of the jazz critics I have good relationships with. Some I would even, one or two I would even consider kind of friends. But, speaking in general terms, they usually don't have a serious musical background, which, that doesn't invalidate all their opinions, but I think sometimes it puts them at a disadvantage. And, the thing is, take for instance, Ornette Coleman, and this is not, I have great respect for him, especially the stuff he did with Don Cherry. A lot of that stuff, I think is great. And he really opened up things, and, incredibly important figure. But, for instance, like harmonic is this term that every musician knows, but nobody knows what it is.
Right.
I'll say I'm not sure that Ornette Coleman knows, if it is a specific thing. He's got an approach, I don't mean to deny that. But to say, like it's a, you can break it down the way you can, like, Baroque contrapuntal technique or something. I don't think it's that specific. Well, the stuff that I've worked on, it is very specific. It does really relate to, music, to, to harmony. It is, I'm not saying that it's, the greatest thing since sliced bread, but I'm saying that it does deserve a little bit of attention. And I tell you, and I've been doing it, live in New York. I've been doing it for 10 years. It's been like pulling teeth.
Uphill battle.
Yeah, it's just like, which is not to say that, You know, I mean, and the way it works, that part of my career, it's like this part of my career is, you know, I have a good time. I love these guys. I love playing the music, and I make money. And every year, it's, you know, I mean, the jobs are fine. I mean, here we are in this nice hotel.
Right.
But for doing the other kind of stuff, it's me using the money I make for that to, you know, to like finance a concert, finance a record, finance this or that, and it gets increasingly hard for me to do, especially, you know, if I do that. I mean, just to give you one example, a couple of years ago, I did a concert. I tried to get an NEA grant. I'd gotten a couple before, but this one, they're getting harder and harder to get. I didn't get it, no funding at all, so I spent $9,000 on my own. A concert, and Mike Brecker was there, Chris Potter. You know, I put together a great band, you know, rehearsed all this new music. One of the things that I did, which I was, you know, interested in doing, you know, the idea of the concert was kind of to use longer forms, kind of like classical forms in a jazz context. So one of the things I did, wrote was this thing called Symphony for Six, which was in a symphony form, but for sextet, and it was all using this new harmonic stuff that I'm working on. And Chip DeFaw from The Post was there, and he loved it. He wrote a really nice review. Peter Watrous was there from The Times, and he just didn't get it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so he, you know, he wrote a, you know, just a very, very dismissive article, you know. And so I'm, you know, I mean, that's not enough to stop me and say, well, hell, I'm not going to do this. Of course I'm going to do it, but it makes me think, you know, is it worth it to spend $9,000 and all I end up with is a bad review in the Times, you know? So, you know, it just makes me think that as far as one of the things that I've kind of decided is that the label jazz is a very tricky thing these days, and I've noticed this with people like John Zorn, who's been very successful, and I mean, like, again, you know, I mean, I don't mean to, you know, I like, you know, the group he's got in Masada with Dave Douglas. I've heard some of his orchestral stuff. He's a very talented guy. He's also a very shrewd guy, and one of the things that's shrewd about him is that he never tried, or I mean, he tried to get himself over as this, you know, this downtown scene musician, avoiding the label jazz, avoiding the comparisons with Coltrane and the Young Lions and the black and white thing and whatever. Just sidesteps that, and he finds his audience, and he establishes his way. And I'm kind of finding the same thing. If I try to promote this as jazz, you run up into a million hurdles from all kinds of directions. If I, on the other hand, go into kind of a contemporary classical music direction, I find that it's like all these barriers break away.
No kidding.
Yeah.
That there's more of a room for something new in that particular field?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of reasons for it. For one thing, I think the critics have at least gone to music school and know something about music. For another thing, well, it's already institutionalized. There's you know, there's funding, there's money, the whole structure of it. I mean, just briefly, one example. I mean, I've had this kind of running battle with BMI, who I'm a member of, because they don't pay for live performances of jazz, but they pay for live performances of classical music. So in other words, you know, for instance, like 2 nights ago, I wrote this huge thing for the Carnegie Hall Jazz Band. I mean, it was an arrangement, so I wouldn't have technically gotten paid. But, you know, I have had jazz compositions performed at Lincoln Center and Carnegie Hall. I don't make a dime. You know, I can have a score that's like an inch thick, but I go out to Tulsa, Oklahoma with the Regional Symphony Orchestra, play a classical piece, I get a nice check in the mail. So, I mean, that's just an example of the way, you know, society, here in the form of BMI, is encouraging, I mean, because to get paid for your work, that's encouragement, you know, is encouraging classical music. Whereas if it's jazz, if it's even called jazz, even if it's almost the same piece, you're treated totally differently, you know. You know, also, I just find a lot of, you know, I think in classical music there's more of you know, it's more openness to do new things, and especially the irony of the whole thing is that basically I'm still, even when I'm doing things that are, you know, what I consider on my idea the cutting edge, I'm still basically conservative, So that for classical music, it's like the stuff that I write, even though it's harmonically, you know, maybe to the point of atonal, it's still very melodic. It still has form you can follow. It's not, you know, crazy, formless, you know. I mean, I try very hard to make
like
it.
It's not free jazz.
Yeah, it's not, no, and the jazz that I play is not free like that too. You know, I mean, it's always got a structure. It always has like a form I want people to follow and understand. It's got melodies. Now, somebody told me, I don't know if this is true. I'm almost too. It would almost piss me off too much if I found it were true. But that at the New York Times that it's kind of policy, and I don't know who said it, that they've decided that the whole concept of melody is passé, and that anything that's melodic is to be kind of, you know, downplayed. You know, I mean, I really hope that isn't true, and it might not be. But you know, it's ludicrous. I mean, to me, you know, the melodies is like I mean, that's the basic thing that people comprehend from music, and the great jazz players are the ones that were able to make melodies, you know, on the spot. So at any rate, that's what I'm trying to do in classical music, and I think, you know, there's a kind of a thirst for things that are contemporary but still accessible, and I think I can do that. With jazz, on the other hand, I feel that something that seems innovative right now is just a little threatening. It's like, you know, people really don't, they don't want it unless it comes from certain people, you know. I mean, you know, like if somehow Wynton Marsalis stops imitating Duke Ellington and does something new,
It'll be okay.
It'll be okay. But I get the feeling with me it's not going to be.
It's more the name than the what they're producing.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a lot of factors and very little, and almost none of them have to do with music.
Yeah.
And again, I don't mean to say, like, you know, Wynton Marsalis is a great musician and all the respect in the world, but I'm just saying that as far as the focus on jazz these days, I think it's gotten pretty far away from music a lot of the time.
Well, you probably wouldn't get a very sympathetic ear at this particular festival if you were to try to do some of your own.
Right.
You know.
And I understand that. That's fine. You know.
In fact, I remember last night just hearing comments around me. These people, they certainly know what they like.
Well, yeah, sure.
And if you go a little above their heads, they'll just say things like, "Ooh, that went right through my head," or something like that. I'll hear these little bits and pieces. And,
yeah, you know, I mean, that brings up another kind of interesting facet is this whole idea, which I've really had to face, of playing older styles, which are really basically formed. I mean, you know, like these styles are set, but to try to play it, you know, I mean, like here it is. Okay, I have this career. This is what I do. Is it possible to do it in a creative way and in a personal way? And I have come to the belief that yes, it is. You know, I mean, I don't mean to hold myself up as a great example, but people like Kenny DeVerne, Warren Vichet, Scott Hamilton. To me, they're very personal voices. They don't sound like, you know, a copy of anybody else. You can't say Kenny DeVerne is a clone of Pee Wee Russell or Benny Goodman or he sounds like like Kenny DeVerne. And yet, you know, he's playing now in this style that was kind of set, you know, decades before. He's still creative, and he's still, you know, there's a way of doing it, and I think that's valid too. And I think so. You know, some critics seem to be aware of that, others aren't. But you know, I mean, that's a difficult thing to pull off.
Well, you've certainly played with a long list of, you know, the really established veterans, and they seem to embrace your approach. The world's greatest jazz band and Benny Carter, and is there a group of people that you really, really look forward to playing with?
Yeah, well, there are people I feel that like one of the problems that I have is that, you know, when I do my own records or these projects which are more modern, that even, you know, conceptually I might have an idea of what I want to do, but there's a difference between that and playing every night, you know, in a certain context. You know, this is the context I usually find myself in. And again, you know, I love these guys, I love playing this music, but I would also love to play, say, you know, Smitty Smith is doing the Tonight Show now, but if you weren't work with him, you know, I mean, I feel like I would grow so much as a player if I could just play with him on a regular basis, or, you know, or to get a chance to work with, I mean, there's a lot of people that, Chick Corea, Herbie Hancock. I mean, I would love to play with those people. I don't know if I ever will, and if I ever did, you know, I mean, I would like to work with them for a period of time and really absorb.
Sure.
Elvin Jones. I mean, I'd love to play with that guy, and I feel like it would help me so much, you know. But you know, I mean, even if I was going to play with guys very influenced, very coming out of that style, just to get a chance to do it on a nightly basis is very, very difficult.
I think that's a very important thing you mentioned, is that it's not going to happen in one night. I mean, if you played with Chick Corea for one night, it would be a thrill, but to play with him for a time would cause you to, you know, expand your own vocabulary, perhaps.
Right, yeah. Right. So, I mean, you know, I guess in a way it's good to always have some things that you want to do that, you know, maybe you do, maybe you never will. But no, I mean, there's a lot of things I would like to do that I haven't done. Sure.
Yeah. You had said some pretty kind words about George Avakian.
Oh, yeah.
That he gave you some good career boosts along the way, or is it you mostly just listening to his productions?
Well, you know, I mean, of course, I grew up listening to a lot of the things that he did for Columbia, you know, which is not only the reissues, but the Miles Davis and Gil Evans. It was his idea to bring those two together. In fact, he says, you know, he went to Miles and you know, Miles has done all these quintet records. He said, you know, now that you're with Columbia, you know, we want to present you in a different way and like put you in a new direction, and you know, we can get this budget together. And he said, you know, why don't you have somebody write something kind of big band or orchestrally, you know, like Gunther Schuller or Gil Evans, you know, and he and of course Miles knew Gil and, you know, ended up picking Gil Evans. But George Avakian was very much a part of that. You know, a lot of great, Sonny Rollins, you know, Duke Ellington stuff, all kinds of things. But he was out of the business for long. I mean, I didn't know if he was still alive or dead. And then just, you know, maybe 6, 7 years ago or something, I was playing in a club and somebody brought him in. And I couldn't believe how young he looked and how, you know, and I mean, he's like really good health, really vital kind of guy. And I was just, you know, I was just amazed. And I was talking about all those things that he did. And he had really been kind of out of it so long, and he didn't have really good feelings about the, you know, the record business, the way it had been run and the way it was being run. But since that time, I mean, I'm happy to say he's gotten back into it. He's doing a lot of work for CBS, Sony with reissue projects. And then just recently, this last June for the JVC Festival, we co-produced a concert, which was this, he managed to find these Louis Armstrong compositions that Louis had never recorded, many of them written in his own hand in the Library of Congress. So, you know, there was about 8 or 9 things that nobody knew was there and hadn't been heard. So we put on a concert where we played them. It was Nicholas Payton and myself, and then we did some Bix Beiderbecke things in the first half, and it got a lot of publicity, and hopefully we'll make a record and do a tour next year.
Did I read that you used some of his own instruments on that?
Yeah. That was kind of an interesting thing. And well, George was kind of responsible for getting there's this couple, the Bob Christensen and his wife, that live in California, and they have Bix Beiderbecke's cornet was engraved with his name on it and everything like that, Bach, the silver Bach cornet, and they just agreed to come to the concert at their own expense and lend us the cornet, and I had never met these people, and it was unbelievable. And then, of course, there's this Louis Armstrong archive at Queens College, and a guy named Michael Cogswell, who's kind of a friend, is the curator there, and part of that, of what they have, is about 6 or 7 horns that belong to Louis. So so I went out there. He let me play them one other time, and he he graciously lent us one for the concert. I went out there and picked one that I liked, and I'd never played the Bix horn until half hour before the concert when they brought it. Yeah, and I kind of assumed that it was going to be in real bad shape. It probably never been cleaned out. That it it was leaky. But the thing just played great. I mean, it was like the best cornet I'd ever played. So I had to play. We were thinking we would just kind of display them in the front, but we didn't know that we would actually play the horns. We ended up, and then the second half, Nicholas tried the Selmer trumpet of Louis, and the first thing he says, "Where can I get one of these?" So he ended up playing that for the second half, and it was I mean it was very moving.
Did they make him wear white gloves when he played? I got to visit out there, and every time he would take something off the shelf.
At the archives there? Yeah.
He very treated with
well,
great
he
respect.
does. No, he's great. He's really doing a fantastic job with that stuff. He didn't make me wear white gloves. He maybe should have, but I said just before I played them that to the audience, I said I almost hesitate to do this because there might still be a little DNA in there. We could clone these guys. I don't want to do anything that might
put my own in there.
Yeah, right. Contaminate that.
Get saliva samples from the horn. That's wild.
Right. But no, that was a thrill. That was a real thrill.
Well, we were talking a little earlier about the concept of improvising.
Right.
And you had mentioned have done some interviews with people
right.
about that, what they think of how they do it. And can you articulate what you're thinking, if you're playing Ain't Misbehavin', for instance,
right.
and you're improvising over the changes, is there something, a thought process that you can talk about?
Well, it's funny because I said I've done these interviews. I've never been interviewed myself on this subject, so I don't, I'm just speaking off the top of my head. But, from my own experience, it's, the less thinking, the better. The more you feel like you're part of the whole group, and that the music is just kind of there. You're just sort of pulling it out of the air. The better you are. And I have that feeling when I write too, by the way, which is, is not that I am really creating it, but it's like the thing is there. It's like you talk about, Michelangelo with David. I mean, it's like, the stone is there, but he sees the thing. It's already in there. He just chips away to get at it. I mean, that's the way it always feels like when I'm writing. It's kind of like prospecting. It's like, the gold is there. It's, all these great compositions have never been written. They're all there. You just have to find them. It's not like, it doesn't feel like I'm the one that's doing it. It's just, somehow your taste or what you, something unconscious is deciding what's gold and what's not in there. But you're not really, I mean, that's the thing. You kind of have to have, I guess, some sort of, discrimination, some kind of, feeling for, well, this does something to me and this doesn't. I think you have to have that kind of feeling to decide, because, like what one person considers gold, another person might not. And that's kind of the beauty of it, because that's why everybody plays differently. But you have to have, I guess, that the important thing is to have that feeling that for some reason this really turns me on, these notes, but these notes, just don't leave me cold, or this rhythm or something like that. And it's that kind of, when it's working, it's kind of feeling like you're not really doing it yourself. It's not a conscious thing. It's just sort of, it's just sort of there. Which is a pretty vague answer, I guess, but
But I've heard it before, actually.
Yeah.
Some people have used the word Zen.
Right.
It's a Zen experience,
Right.
but I think the challenge with that is to try to relate that to younger players, because some of the veterans complain that the younger musicians are just playing scales, and they've got all this knowledge of chords and modes and blah blah blah, but they're not creating melodies And how do you tell them how to do that?
All right.
Maybe it's not possible.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what makes the jazz cream rise to
Yeah,
the top.
yeah. I mean, I don't know that that's so much a generational thing, because I think it's always been like that. There have been a few players that can just make it sing and you know, take wings and whatever, and then a lot of people, for whatever reason, you know, it's just less than that. You know, and there's some players these days that, you know, I think are quite lyrical, and you know, even younger players, and you know, and then guys who are not. I don't know. One thing that, just going back to another thing about playing, one thing that sort of interests me. I mean, I guess that you know, it's like Louis Armstrong, for instance. He could play with the worst band in the world, and you know, at times he not the worst band, but you know, guys that were just like on a totally, you know, different. I mean, nobody was on his level, but I mean, like way under. And he would say that he didn't even hear the band, you know, like he would just play. He just had such a strong feeling inside him that he would just charge ahead, and it would just fall into place. And he could do that, and I mean, of course, you know, that's him. I cannot do that. I mean, I can do that to a certain extent, but I always feel very much like I'm playing with the guys, and that my playing is affected, for better or worse, by what's going on around me. Mm-hmm. And you know, sometimes I feel like it's very difficult for me to like really get it happening if it doesn't seem like it is around me. You know, I'll try, but you know, I mean, I guess that's the nature of the thing. Sometimes you feel like it's work, other times it's just happening by itself. Yeah. And it doesn't necessarily, there's so many variables. I mean, it's not just even the caliber of the musicians. I mean, because, I mean, the night after last, we were doing this thing at Carnegie Hall, and I played a few small group things. The rhythm section was terrific. Some of the tunes felt really good. The last tune we did, it just, you know, it just felt like, I mean, I don't know if the audience perceived this, you know, but it just felt like, for whatever reason, it just was not coming together. It was an effort all the way through. And, you know, I mean, it sounded okay. I mean, nobody did any obvious goofs, but
yeah.
But to me, it just didn't really have the feeling that, you know, it wasn't comfortable. And, you know, of course, early on, you know, like when you don't feel comfortable, there's always a tendency to blame yourself. I think when you get experience, you tend to notice a little bit more that it's, you know, it's other things too. You know, but it's, you know, I mean, you just get into so many variables, so that you could, you know, the weather, you know, how people are feeling, the acoustics.
Yeah, you only have so much control over that situation.
Right. And that's part of it. I mean, like, if you're just doing it a lot, you just have to do it regardless of what it feels like, and also know that it changes. I mean, you can start off, you know, feeling like you're kind of beating a dead horse, or like, you know, walking a mountain uphill, but then it can catch on, and then you forget it, and it's, you know.
These situations at the jazz festivals where you have 3 or 4 horns on stage and you pick a standard, is it that much different from the New Orleans jazz as far as how the ensemble works? Does it pretty much date back to that?
Well, it depends. It depends. You know, if you're playing with a clarinet and the trombone, and you're playing with guys that kind of come out of that tradition, I mean, there's certain roles that, you know, that people tend to play. I mean, that you know, like if I'm playing with Kenny DeVerne, say, and Dan Barrett, then, you know, like we'll do that kind of playing where I stick fairly close to the lead, you know, fairly close to the melody, improvising more on the melody. You know, Kenny is playing above me, you know, usually more notes, more obligato, and Dan, you know, will be playing below, kind of like a embellished, embroidered, kind of a bass part. But you know, I mean, I mean, with those guys, because they're so great at it, that they can kind of, you know, find their instant harmony parts where they're kind of, you know, where the clarinet kind of, you know, like plays the next harmony below the trumpet, but an octave above, and then the trumpet. You know, they just know what to do, and even though it's still, you know, it's still free, and you know, there's a million different ways they could do it. they're still very, attuned to that kind of playing. Then some of the other guys, like say for instance, like guys like Connie Condoli. I don't know if there are too many other guys around here like that, but or maybe Joe Templey. They come out of a different sort of school, which is kind of the swing bebop thing, where people when they play ahead, it tends to be unison,
Yeah.
just play the melody. Like Charlie Parker and Dizzy would do it or something like
Right.
that. Now, those are two completely different ways. And sometimes you get caught in between, where it's like a little bit up for grabs, and it can feel slightly uncomfortable at times. My preference is that even when I'm playing, well, for instance, I did a gig not too long ago with John Gordon, who's a great young saxophone player. He's the guy who just won the Thelonious Monk competition on saxophone, and we were playing all these heads, and it's trumpet and alto, and the traditional thing is to play unison. Well, if we didn't have time to rehearse, it's always a little dangerous because, our conception of we might have different ideas of how a rhythm goes or the melody, and to me, nothing sounds worse than, you're playing this unison, and then suddenly it goes out of sync.
It's not quite unison, yeah.
So, I just told them, I'll play the melody and you improvise around it, or play a harmony or a background part or something. I prefer that, just, unless you can really rehearse specifically what you want to do.
Yeah.
Or it's a head that everybody knows. Like last night they did Donna Lee, and everybody up there knew it, so they could play that unison. But, even a lot of tunes that everybody knows, that they might phrase it differently,
Yeah.
Right. So, it's just one of those, it's kind of like a gray area sometimes.
Yeah.
But that's one of the things that's interesting about these jazz parties. And kind of, they were sort of started by this guy, Dick Gibson, in Denver. And when he started doing it, he was having, he was bringing together guys from the Dixieland tradition and guys from the bebop tradition at a time, back in the 60s, when the two really didn't meet on too much common musical ground. They were still thought of as pretty separate. And I think one of the contributions, if you want to call it that, of the jazz party has been kind of forcing these two styles together into a way that they can kind of coexist, so that now you can have somebody like, Phil Woods and Doc Cheatham is gone, unfortunately, but the two of them,
Right.
Could meet together and find some common ground, and
Yeah.
make it work. And, in a way, that's kind of a new development, which doesn't really get much attention, but,
Right.
But that is a development in jazz that did happen, that wasn't there, 30,
Yeah.
40 years ago.
Well, to wrap up here, have you got any words of advice for up-and-coming jazz artists?
Well, I think the most creative part of the whole thing is getting your career going, and it's going to be different for everyone. And the people that do it are the ones that are, it's like they don't have any choice. This is what they have to do, and they do it, and they find a way, and they meet the other guys that feel the same way, and then somehow they start forming groups, and you go through that period in your 20s where you're willing to sleep on floors and crash at people's places and do whatever it takes, and trust that, hopefully it's, come out on the other side. I mean, I think on the positive side, it is, maybe some opportunities are opening up. It's kind of a double-edged sword, this bit about the, a little bit more media. Jazz is kind of getting into the mainstream American culture more than it has been. And, with it comes all the other parts of mainstream culture, like, just the kind of media focused on personalities, focused on looks, focused on this and that. But at the same time, it's creating, some kind of economic base, some money's coming in. So it means opportunities, means more people are
Yeah.
just talking about it, curious, and then, and then there'll be more things going on in the margins that might be interesting. So, I mean, it's tough, but it, it can be done to, to turn it into a career, to do it.
Yeah.
And, and I see young guys breaking in every year. I feel sorry for people moving to New York and having to deal with the expense and and you got to be prepared for having this double life of doing something else to make money or have some money saved up and until you get things rolling, and that can take that can take some years.
Yeah.
But people still do it. They still do it.
Is there any kind of racial thing happening in jazz right now that could be better?
Yeah, I think it definitely could be better. I mean, it's not across the board. I think it's just certain pockets of it, and I think in general, it's the the musicians have always been open-minded. They can hear, they can tell what's going on. I mean, I've had like for instance, Bobby Watson, he once said to me, he said, like I see, so many white musicians being left behind, it's not right, and all that kind of stuff, and I mean, they know what's going on, and I don't think, I mean, I think, like white musicians, I think, feel very divided about it because they're aware of the fact, of course, I mean, forget the, like all the social discrimination that blacks have had to face, for, centuries. But, just musically, I mean, the opportunities were very limited for black players. I mean, there's a lot of great black players from the 20s who, like, in the 30s were out of the music business and doing other things. So, they had it rough. But the part that bothers me is just, people who should be a little bit objective. I'm just bothered anytime the focus is not on the music. I mean, music should be judged on its own terms, not on racial terms. And I think one of the things I see happening is that jazz, in the way it's being marketed, by promoters, producers, club owners, and all that, it's kind of turning into like the New York club scene. To me, seems like it's sort of turning into a folklore show. You know what I mean? I mean, it's like, like you go down to Mexico, and you go into the place, and they, so for the tourists, they have all the people, wear their fancy, clothes and bring out the guitars and do all this stuff. Well, they'd probably not be caught dead in that, if they weren't getting paid to do that. I mean, I'm kind of stretching the point maybe a little, but I get the feeling that a lot of clubs in New York, they feel like, well, a lot of money is coming from, Japanese, Europeans. They're trying to recreate a scene of, what they want New York to be, and that's like having some young black guys play bebop, so that people can fantasize, oh man, this is where Miles was, and train, and that's great, and that's fine. But again, that's not a musical consideration.
Right.
And I mean, and they're young black guys who are fantastic, but they're also young white guys too. And I mean, it's like the older guys. I mean, we're another situation. But I mean, just to take an example, that I would say, now Joshua Redman, I think he's one of the most talented of the younger musicians around today. I mean, he knocks me out. He's a great, great player. But so is Chris Potter. Chris Potter knocks me out too. Now Chris is working. He's doing very well. He's getting records out. But there's no comparison between the kind of attention that Joshua gets and the kind of and also the freedom that Joshua gets to take his own group around, because ultimately, see, like, it does ultimately have an effect on the music, because here's one guy who's given the chance to develop his own thing. Now Chris can do that, but he's got less of a chance.
Yeah.
And it's more like what I was talking about, where maybe he'll get a group together for a record date a week before and do it. But that's different than having your own group play at festival after festival for a year. And he's going to be at a disadvantage. And it's, I don't want to say that it's going to make his music less strong, but it makes it harder for him.
Yeah.
And it's just a reality of the situation now. And as I say, that's one of the reasons that I want to kind of focus my creative, original stuff more in the direction of, classical music, contemporary classical music, because I mean, I just frankly, I'm really tired of dealing with the whole thing.
Yeah.
you know, I just, you know, I'm a musician. You know, either you like my music or not. But you know, just taken on those terms, and I just
Right.
feel like jazz. It's like, you know, it's just so many things have gotten in the way of that for you know, for people like me.
Yeah.
So, and I, you know, as I say, I think the musicians are themselves are pretty cool about it. Although, you know, I am disturbed by, you know, you know, some of the stuff at Lincoln Center
Yeah.
going on. I think there is an agenda there as much as they deny. And I've sat down, I've talked to Stanley Crouch. I know Stanley Crouch. You know, I know Wynton Marsalis a little bit. I mean, we've talked a couple of times. I think I've talked more in depth with Stanley Crouch, and you know, like he says that you know, it's not a racial thing. That you know, I mean, like we just want to develop the jazz canon and just focus on, you know, we can't focus on Bix Beiderbecke until we've, you know, focused on all these other people, and that's great. But you know, you happen to mention, you know, well, you know, what about Benny Goodman, or what about Gil Evans, and what about Bill Evans? You know, not that, you know, they should have whole concerts or whatever, but just to get his opinion. And he always like has some dismissive way of like, if you know, it's just by coincidence. He'll say it's not racial, but just coincidentally, if you bring up the name of any white, you know, Benny, we will never do Benny Goodman. You know, it's like, and I mean, I don't know if we got to finish up here. Well, I don't know when your next person is.
We're okay.
Yeah, okay. But I mean, like an irony. See, like you got me going now. But an irony is like, now take Benny Goodman, who was really until recently known for this guy who broke the color barrier.
Right.
You know, he was the guy that hired Lionel Hampton and Teddy Wilson, and he was like you know, when Benny Goodman died, I was just that week I was doing a concert opposite Lionel Hampton, and Lionel Hampton got to the microphone. He said, Benny Goodman was the Abraham Lincoln of jazz. You know, if it wasn't for him, you know, like I wouldn't be here doing as well as I am. You know, now Benny Goodman was a strange personality, and there's a lot of people didn't like him, and he was weird. There's no question about that. I mean, I can tell you firsthand, although that isn't the whole story. But for some reason, it's, you know, I just see this thing happening, kind of like, you know, like the, I don't know if it's a Jewish thing, if it's. But it's similar to, you know, like there was so much of a Jewish, you know, sympathy for the civil rights movement, and so many, you know, like Schwerner and Cheney, whatever, then, you know, shot down there.
Yeah.
And then there's all this black backlash against Jews, and I sort of find that, I mean, I don't know if it's a Jewish thing or what it is, but for some reason Benny Goodman, it's been turned around from that he was helping black people to he was exploiting them. You know, he was buying these Fletcher Henderson arrangements for $25 and not giving them credit or whatever, and Fletcher's band went out of business, and Benny's making all these hits. And it's like he's, you know, instead of helping these black people, it's like he's using them, you know, and it's like all these motives get really, you know, it's just like there's this lack of trust and lack of, you know, I think, you know, wanting to understand the situation. And one of the, and I think there's a general willingness for, you know, maybe younger black musicians to believe that it was worse for the older musicians than it was. Because although, you know, I think, you know, Duke Ellington, you know, when those guys traveled down south, it was horrible. And Louis Armstrong, I mean, and that, you know, that's on record. Those guys, you know, it was miserable, the stuff they had to deal with, and nobody should have gone through that. But still, they were, you know, because this country, just if something sells, you know, people don't care about black, white, whatever. Those guys were able to get their music out, and artistically, they were not stymied. You know, today I think it's a little different because I just feel like certain people are just not being allowed to express themselves because of a racial thing that really. You know, it wasn't. People want to think that it was that way back then with Duke and Louis Armstrong. It wasn't.
And they don't complain about it like.
No, that generation. No, they're very cool. You know, Buck. You know, I mean, that's another irony is that the guys who lived through that. I mean, Clark Terry, you know, had some terrible experiences. Buck Clayton, you know, like told me himself about one time when I think he was down south and he. I can't remember the exact story, but it's like, you know, like 2 carloads of you know, these rednecks pulled up, and he thought that was it. He thought he was going to die. I mean, he was in those situations where his life was on the line just because of the color of his skin. And yet, he bore no animus towards, you know, white people. You know, he wouldn't generalize, you know. And I, you know, it disturbs me a little bit that, you know, like now that things are better, there are a lot of opportunities, you know, especially for younger black players. But I just, you know, I kind of sense this, you know, like they kind of like thrive on some of them. You know, I don't want to generalize.
I know what you're saying, though.
You know, but they're being encouraged to feel that way, I think. And you know, I mean, look, it's a phase. Nothing lasts forever. You know, the pendulum swings. You know, maybe you know, because of the quirks of history, things have to be this way right now, and we'll get to another side of it and everything. As I say, just as I see it, you know, my frustration is, okay, well, this is the time have to be living in. I look back on this time when Bix and Louie just loved each other and got along playing, when you know, there was so much fraternity. I mean, like Flip Phillips in these interviews that I've had, you know, with these guys, and I would ask them about this, and I said, no, there's no, you know, like they got along like brothers. I mean, between the musicians, it was like just totally cool.
Yeah. Well, you said it about 5 times already, that the music was the focus.
Right, right.
That the music brought them together, I would guess.
Right. And I mean, the thing is, like, ultimately anything that divides, I mean, that's another irony, is that the whole thing about jazz is that it was kind of a melting pot. What keeps it alive is all the influences coming in. Anything that you know, I mean, when you get into this kind of like racial purification, it's kind of like Nazi talk. I mean, that's the opposite of art, the opposite of something living, breathing. It's got to take in. I mean, to quote Jack Walrath, who was, you know, who was kind of like saying, you know, he was like speaking against this idea of trying to form a jazz, saying that this is jazz and this isn't jazz, and you know, that there should be this canon and this definition of what, you know, what it is and what it isn't. You know, he's saying, look, you know, the St. Louis blues, you know, I don't know, it's from 1905, and the second strain is a tango. You know, I mean, it says it right there. You know, I mean, what is this purity stuff? You know, there's nothing pure about it. It's like, you know, it's anybody who feels it belongs to them, you know, and then whatever they can bring, you know, European. I mean, it's ridiculous because there's, you know, these great European players now, and I heard these guys from Russia sent me a record, really good players, and I wrote back to the guy and I said, you know, look, this record is great, but it sounds like it was made in New York. I said, like, you know, like, there's so many interesting rhythmic things in the music from your part of the world, you know, put some of that in there.
Yeah, don't be ashamed. Don't feel that you have to do it.
I mean, don't you know, bring what you've got into it, and it'll just make it stronger for everybody. And of course, that happens. That'll happen. But, you know, whether that gets focused on, I mean, at this moment, it's, you know, like other things get more attention, but that's just the way it is right now. So.
Well, I appreciate your eloquent thoughts on that subject, and I hope that in a few years we can do this again and we'll be able to talk about your recordings that focus on your concepts.
Yeah,
and I hope
well, the orchestra record will be out by then. So.
Yeah, right. And whatever you're calling it at the time, you know, that's cool.
Yeah.
So on behalf of the Hamilton College, I want to thank you. And
okay, well, it's been a rare pleasure for me because I don't get a chance to spout off this that often. So, yeah, thanks a lot, Mark. Okay.